Chapter 10. The Mobilization of the Navy. Cabinet Tension. There was complete agreement in the Cabinet upon every telegram sent by Sir Edward Grey, and in his handling of the crisis. But there was also an invincible refusal on the part of the majority to contemplate British intervention by force of arms should the Foreign Secretary's efforts fail and a European war begin. Thus, as the terrific week wore on, and the explosion became inevitable, it seemed probable that a rupture of the political organism by which the country had so long been governed was also rapidly approaching. I lived this week entirely in the official circle, seeing scarcely anyone but my colleagues of the Cabinet or of the Admiralty, and moving only to and fro across the Horse Guards between Admiralty House and Downing Street. Each day as the telegrams arrived showing the darkening scene of Europe, and the cabinets ended in growing tension, I pulled over the various levers which successfully brought our naval organisation into full preparedness. It was always necessary to remember that if peace was preserved, every one of these measures, alarmist in their character and involving much expense, would have to be justified to the Liberal House of Commons. That assembly, once delivered from the peril, would certainly proceed upon the assumption that British participation in a continental struggle would have been criminal madness. Yet it was not practical often to divert the main discussions of the Cabinet into purely technical channels. It was therefore necessary for me to take a peculiar and invidious personal responsibility for many things that had to be done when their turn came. I had also to contemplate a break-up of the governing instrument. Judged by reports and letters from members, the attitude of the House of Commons appeared most uncertain. The opposition leaders. On Thursday evening, I entered into communication with the Unionist leaders through Mr. F. E. Smith. I informed him of the increasing gravity of the European situation, and of the military preparedness which were everywhere in progress in Europe. I stated that no decision had been reached by the Cabinet, and that I had received letters from one or two Unionists of influence, protesting vehemently against our being drawn into a continental war. I asked him to let me know where he and his friends stood on the supreme issue. He replied at once he himself was unreservedly for standing by France and Belgium. After consulting with Mr. Bernard Law, Sir Edward Carson and others, who were gathered at Sir Edward Golding's house at Wargrave, he sent me the following written assurance, which I showed to Mr. Asquith the next morning, Saturday. The Naval Reserves. At the Cabinet, I demanded the immediate calling out of the Fleet Reserves and the completion of our naval preparations. I based this claim on the fact that the German Navy was mobilising, and that we must do the same. The Cabinet, who were by no means ill-informed on matters of naval organisation, took the view after a sharp discussion that this step was not necessary to our safety, as mobilisation only affected the oldest ships in the fleet, and that our main naval power was already in full preparedness for war and the fleet in its war station. I replied that though this was true, we needed the Third Fleet ships, particularly the older cruisers, to fulfil their roles assigned to them in our war plan. However, I did not succeed in procuring their assent. On Saturday evening, I dined alone at the Admiralty. The foreign telegrams came in at short intervals in red boxes, which already bore the special label, Subcommittee, denoting the precautionary period. The flow was quite continuous, and the impression produced on my mind, after reading for nearly an hour, was that there was still a chance of peace. Austria had accepted the conference, and intimate personal appeals were passing between the Tsar and the Kaiser. It seemed to me, from the order in which I read the series of telegrams, that at the very last moment Sir Edward Grey might succeed in saving the situation. So far, no shot had been fired between the great powers. I wondered whether armies and fleets could remain mobilised for a space without fighting, and then demobilise. British decision to close the channel to German warships. Germany declares war on Russia. General mobilisation of the Navy. I had already achieved this thought when another Foreign Office box came in. I opened it and read, Germany has declared war on Russia. There was no more to be said. I walked across the Horse Guards parade and entered 10 Downing Street by the garden gate. I found the Prime Minister upstairs in his drawing room. With him were Sir Edward Grey, Lord Haldane, and Lord Crewe. There may have been other ministers. I said that I intended instantly to mobilise the fleet, notwithstanding the Cabinet decision, and that I would take full personal responsibility to the Cabinet the next morning. The Prime Minister, who felt himself bound to the Cabinet, said not a single word, but it was clear from his look that he was quite content. As I walked down the steps of Downing Street, and Sir Edward Grey said to me, "You should know I have just done a very important thing. I have told Cambon that we shall not allow the German fleet to come into the Channel." I went back to the Admiralty and gave forthwith the order to mobilise. We had no legal authority for calling up the Naval Reserves, as no proclamation had been submitted to His Majesty, in view of the Cabinet decision, but we were quite sure that the fleet men would unquestionably obey the summons. This action was ratified by the Cabinet on Sunday morning, and the royal proclamation was issued some hours later. Sir John Jellicoe appointed Commander-in-Chief. Another decision, and a painful one, was required. Sir George Callaghan's command of the home fleets had been extended by a year, and was now due to end on October the 1st. It had been announced that he would then be succeeded by Sir John Jellicoe. Further, our arrangements prescribed that Sir John Jellicoe should act as second in command in the event of war. The First Sea Lord and I had a conference with Sir George Callaghan, on his way through London to the north on the 30th. As a result of this conference, we decided that if war came, it would be necessary to appoint Sir John Jellicoe immediately to the chief command. We were doubtful as to Sir George Callaghan's health and physical strength being equal to the immense strain that would be cast upon him, and in the crash of Europe, it was no time to consider individuals. Sir John Jellicoe left London for the fleet with sealed orders, directing him on the seals being broken to take over the command. On the night of the 2nd of August, when we considered war certain, we telegraphed to both admirals apprising them of the Admiralty decision. It was naturally a cruel blow to Sir George Callaghan to have to lay down his charge at such a moment, and his protests were re-echoed by practically all the principal admirals who had served under him and by Sir John Jellicoe himself. It was also a grave matter to make a change in the command of the fleets at this juncture. However, we did what we thought right, and that without an hour's delay, to Sir John Jellicoe I telegraphed, "Your feelings do you credit, and we understand them, but the responsibility rests with us, and we have given our decision. Take up your great task in buoyancy and hope. We are sure that all will be well." Sir John Jellicoe assumed command on the evening of the 3rd of August, and received almost immediately an order from the Admiralty to proceed at sea at daylight on the 4th. The Cabinet sat almost continuously throughout this Sunday, and up till luncheon time it looked as if the majority would resign. The grief and horror of so many able colleagues were painful to witness. But what could anyone do? In the luncheon interval, I saw Mr. Balfour, a veritable rock in times like these, and learned that the Unionist leaders had tendered formally in writing to the Prime Minister their unqualified assurances of support. I returned to the Admiralty. We telegraphed to our Commanders-in-Chief. Today, August the 2nd, at 2:20, the following note was handed to the French and German ambassadors. Begins, "The British government would not allow the passage of German ships through the English Channel or the North Sea in order to attack the coastal shipping of France. Ends. Be prepared to meet surprise attacks." German invasion of Luxembourg and Belgium. Meanwhile, events were influencing opinion hour by hour. When the Cabinet met on Sunday morning, we were in presence of the violation of the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg by the German troops. In the evening, the German ultimatum to Belgium was delivered. The next day arrived the appeal of the King of the Belgians that the guaranteeing powers should uphold the sanctity of the treaty regarding the neutrality of Belgium. This last was decisive. By Monday, the majority of Mr. Asquith's colleagues regarded war as inevitable. Discussion was resumed on Monday morning in a different atmosphere, though it seemed certain that there would be numerous resignations. Monday, 3rd of August, in the House of Commons, British ultimatum to Germany. Before the Cabinet separated on Monday morning, Sir Edward Grey had procured a predominant assent to the principal points and general tone of his statement to Parliament that afternoon. Formal sanction had been given to the already completed mobilisation of the fleet and to the immediate mobilisation of the army. No decision had been taken to send an ultimatum to Germany or to declare war upon Germany, still less to send an army to France. These supreme decisions were never taken at any cabinet. They were compelled by the force of events and rest on the authority of the Prime Minister. We repaired to the House of Commons to hear the statement of the Foreign Secretary. I did not know which of our colleagues had resigned or what composition of a war government would be. The aspect of the Assembly was awed but resolute. No one could mistake its intention. Sir Edward Grey made his statement with the utmost moderation. In order that there should be no ground for future reproaches, he informed the House that the Germans were willing to comply with the British demand that no German warships should be sent into the English Channel. The sombre march of his argument carried this weighty admission forward in its stride. When he sat down, he was possessed in an overwhelming measure of the support of the Assembly. Neither he nor I could remain long in the House. Outside I asked him, "What happens now?" "Now," he said, "we shall send an ultimatum to stop the invasion of Belgium within 24 hours. Some of the ministers still clung to the hope that Germany would comply with the British ultimatum and would arrest the onrush of her armies upon Belgium. As well recall the Avalanche as easily suspend in mid-career the great ship that had been launched and is sliding down the ways. Germany was already at war with Russia and France. It was certain that in 24 hours she would be at war with the British Empire also." Nation and Empire. All through the tense discussions of the Cabinet, one had in mind another great debate, which must begin when these were concluded. Parliament, the nation, the dominions would have to be convinced. That the cause was good, that the argument was overwhelming, that the response would be worthy, I did not for a moment doubt. But it seemed that an enormous political task awaited us, and I saw in the mind's eye not only the crowded Houses of Commons, but formidable assemblies of the people throughout the land requiring full and swift justification of the flaming action taken in their name. But such cares were soon dispersed. When the council doors had opened, the ministers had come into the outer air. The British nation was already surging forward in its ancient valour, and the Empire had sprung to arms. Meanwhile, in the Mediterranean, a drama of intense interest, and as it ultimately proved, fatal consequence, was being enacted. The event which would dominate all others if war broke out was the main shock of battle between the French and German armies. We knew that the French were counting on placing in the line a whole army corps of their best troops from North Africa, and that every man was needed. We were informed also that they intended to transport these troops across the Mediterranean as fast as ships could be loaded, under the general protection of the French fleet, but without any individual escort or system of convoys. The French General Staff calculated that whatever happened, most of the troops would get across. The French fleet, disposed between this stream of transports and the Austrian fleet, afforded a good guarantee. But there was one ship in the Mediterranean which far outstripped in speed every vessel in the French navy. She was the Gerbon. The only heavy ships in the Mediterranean that could attempt to compete with the Gerbon in speed were the 3 British battle cruisers. It seemed that the Gerbon, being free to choose any point on a front of 300 or 400 miles, would easily be able to avoid the French battle squadrons, and brushing aside or outstripping their cruisers, break in upon the transports and sink one after another of these vessels crammed with soldiers. It occurred to me at this time that perhaps that was the task she had been sent to the Mediterranean to perform. For this reason, as a further precaution, I had suggested to the First Sea Lord as early as the 28th of July that an additional battle cruiser, the New Zealand, should be sent to reinforce our squadron. When it came to a pinch a few days later, Admiral Bouet de Lapierre, the French commander-in-chief, adopted a system of convoys, and on the 4th of August, he prudently delayed the embarkation of the troops until he could organise adequate escorts. But of this change of plan, the Admiralty was not advised. Situation in the Mediterranean. Menace of the Gerbon. On the 30th of July, I called for the war orders of the Mediterranean Command and discussed them fully with the First Sea Lord. These orders, issued in August 1913, had to take into consideration a variety of political contingencies. Great Britain at war with Germany alone, with Germany and Austria alone, or with Germany, Austria and Italy, and Great Britain and France allied together against each or any of the three aforesaid opponents. The course to be followed differed somewhat in each case. Briefly, if Britain found herself single-handed against the whole Triple Alliance, we should temporarily have to abandon the Mediterranean and concentrate at Gibraltar. In all other cases, the concentration would be at Malta, and if the French were allies, our squadrons would join them for a general battle. It now seemed necessary to give the Commander-in-Chief in the Mediterranean some more specific information and directions. Admiralty Instructions to Sir Berkeley Milne. Admiralty to Commander-in-Chief, Mediterranean, July the 30th, 1914. It now seems probable, should war break out, and England and France engage in it, that Italy will remain neutral and that Greece can be made an ally. Spain also will be friendly and possibly an ally. The attitude of Italy is, however, uncertain, and it is especially important that your squadron should not be seriously engaged with Austrian ships before we know what Italy will do. Your first task should be to aid the French in the transportation of their African army by covering, and if possible, bringing to action individual fast German ships, particularly Gerbon, which may interfere with that transportation. You will be notified by telegraph when you may consult with the French Admiral. Except in combination with the French as part of a general battle, do not at this stage be brought to action against superior forces. The speed of your squadrons is sufficient to enable you to choose your moment. You must husband your force at the outset, and we shall hope later to reinforce the Mediterranean. These directions, on which the First Sea Lord and I were completely in accord, gave the Commander-in-Chief guidance in the general conduct of the naval campaign. They warned him against fighting a premature single-handed battle with the Austrian fleet, in which our battle cruisers and cruisers would be confronted with Austrian dreadnought battleships, and told him to aid the French in transporting their African forces, and they told him how to do it, by covering, and if possible, bringing to action individual fast German ships, particularly Gerbon. So far as the English language may serve as a vehicle of thought, the words employed appear to express the intentions we have informed. Sir Berkeley Milne accordingly replied on July the 31st that he would keep his forces concentrated in readiness to assist the French fleet to protect the transports, and he rightly left our trade in the eastern Mediterranean to shift for itself. In this posture, he waited permission to consult with the French Admiral. This permission could not be given him until the 2nd of August at 7 p.m, when I telegraphed as follows to our Commanders-in-Chief all over the world. Situation very critical. Be prepared to meet surprise attacks. You can enter into communication with the French senior officer on your station for combined action in case Great Britain should decide to become ally of France against Germany. Earlier that same day, the following, initialed both by the First Sea Lord and myself, was also sent to Sir Berkeley Milne from the Admiralty. Gerbon must be shadowed by 2 battle cruisers. Approaches to Adriatic must be watched by cruisers and destroyers. Remain near Malta yourself. It is believed that Italy will remain neutral, but you cannot yet count absolutely on this. At 12:50 a.m. on the 3rd of August, I emphasised the importance of the Gerbon compared with all other objectives by a further telegram, which I drafted myself to Sir Berkeley Milne. Watch on mouth of Adriatic should be maintained, but Gerbon is your objective. Follow her and shadow her wherever she goes, and be ready to act on declaration of war, which appears probable and imminent. Early on the morning of August the 4th, we were delighted by the following news from the Commander-in-Chief, Mediterranean to the Admiralty. Indomitable, indefatigable, shadowing Gerbon and Breslau, 3744 degrees north, 756 east. We replied, very good, hold her, war imminent. Gerbon is to be prevented by force from interfering with French transports. I then informed the Prime Minister and Sir Edward Grey of the situation, and of my desire to send the additional instructions. Both agreed to it, but the Prime Minister asked that it should be mentioned to the Cabinet, which was meeting almost immediately, for their confirmation. On this I sent, before going to the Cabinet, the following. If Gerbon attacks French transports, you should at once engage her. You should give her fair warning of this beforehand. The Cabinet, however, adhered formally to the view that no act of war should be committed by us before the expiration of the ultimatum. The moral integrity of the British Empire must not be compromised at this solemn moment for the sake of sinking a single ship. The Gerbon of course did not attack the French transports. In fact, though this we did not know at the time, she was steaming away from the French transport routes when sighted by the Indomitable and Indefatigable. Even if, however, she had attacked transports, the decision of the British Cabinet would have prevented our battle cruisers from interfering. This decision obviously carried with it the still more imperative veto against opening fire on the Gerbon if she did not attack French transports. During the hours when we had her in our power, I cannot impeach the decision. It is right that the world should know of it. But little did we imagine how much this spirit of honourable restraint was to cost us and all the world. In consequence of the Cabinet decision, the First Sea Lord sent by my directions the following telegram from the Admiralty. Admiralty to all ships, 4th of August. The British ultimatum to Germany will expire at midnight, Greenwich Mean Time, August the 4th. No act of war should be committed before that hour, at which time the telegram to commence hostilities against Germany will be dispatched from the Admiralty. Special edition to Mediterranean, Indomitable, Indefatigable. This cancels the authorization to Indomitable and Indefatigable to engage Gerbon if she attacks French transports. At about the same time, I received the following minute from the First Sea Lord. First Lord, August the 4th. In view of the Italian declaration of neutrality, proposed to telegraph to Commander-in-Chief Mediterranean, acquainting him and enjoining him to respect this rigidly and not to allow a ship to come within 6 miles of the Italian coast. Bearing in mind how disastrous it would be if any petty incident occurred which could cause trouble at this fateful moment with Italy, and approving of the First Sea Lord's precaution, I replied in writing. So proceed. Foreign Office should intimate this to Italian government. Thereupon at 12:55 p.m, the following telegram was sent by the Admiralty to the Commander-in-Chief in the Mediterranean. Italian government have declared neutrality. You are to respect this neutrality rigidly, and should not allow any of His Majesty's ships to come within 6 miles of Italian coast. This certainly, as it turned out, was destined to complicate the task of capturing the Gerbon, but not, as it will appear, in a decisive manner. During the afternoon, I sent the following minute to the Chief of the Staff and the First Sea Lord. August the 4th, 1914. I presume you have fully informed French Admiralty of our intentions, and that the closest cooperation has been established at all points with the French fleet. If not, this should be done immediately. On this, the Chief of the Staff sent the following telegram to all stations. You can enter into the closest cooperation with the French officers on your station. Throughout this long summer afternoon, 3 great ships, Hunted and Hunters, were cleaving the clear waters of the Mediterranean, in tense and oppressive calm. At any moment, the Gerbon could have been smitten at under 10,000 yards range by 16 12-inch guns, firing nearly treble her own weight of metal. At the Admiralty, we suffered the tortures of Tantalus. At about 5 o'clock, Prince Louis observed that there was still time to sink the Gerbon before dark. In the face of the Cabinet decision, I was unable to utter a word. Nothing less than the vital safety of Great Britain could have justified so complete an overriding of the authority of the Cabinet. We hoped to sink her the next day. Where could she go? Polar seemed her only refuge throughout the Mediterranean. According to international law, nothing but internment awaited her elsewhere. The Turks had kept their secret well. As the shadows of night fell over the Mediterranean, the Gerbon increased her speed to 24 knots, which was the utmost that our 2 battle cruisers could steam. She increased her speed still further. We have since learned that she was capable for a very short time of an exceptional speed, rising even to 26 or 27 knots. Aided by this, she shook off her unwelcome companions and vanished gradually into the gathering gloom. We shall return to this story in due course. At 5:50 p.m. we sent the following message. Admiralty to all ships. General message. The war telegram will be issued at midnight, authorising you to commence hostilities against Germany. But in view of our ultimatum, they may decide to open fire at any moment. You must be ready for this. Now, after all the stress and convulsion of the preceding 10 days, there came to us at the Admiralty a strange interlude of calm. All the decisions had been taken. The ultimatum to Germany had gone. It must certainly be rejected. War would be declared at midnight. As far as we had been able to foresee the event, all our preparations were made. Mobilization was complete. Every ship was in its station, every man at his post. All over the world, every British captain and admiral was on guard. It only remained to give the signal. What would happen then? It seemed that the next move lay with the enemy. What would he do? Had he some deadly surprise in store? Some awful design long planned and perfected, ready to explode upon us at any moment? Now! Would our ships in foreign waters have been able to mark down their German antagonists? If so, morning would witness 6 cruiser actions in the outer seas. Telegrams flowed in from the different naval stations round our coasts, reporting the movements of vessels and rumours of sightings of enemies. Telegrams still flowed in from the chancelleries of Europe, as the last futile appeals of reason were overtaken by the cannonade. In the war room of the Admiralty, where I sat waiting, one could hear the clock tick. From Parliament Street came the murmurs of the crowd, but they sounded distant and the world seemed very still. The tumult of the struggle for life was over. It was succeeded by the silence of ruin and death. We were to awake in pandemonium. I had the odd sense that it was like waiting for an election result. The turmoil of the contest seemed finished. The votes were being counted, and in a few hours the announcement would be made. One could only wait, but for what result? Although the special duties of my office made it imperative that I, of all others, should be vigilant and forward in all that related to preparation of war, I claim, as these pages show, that in my subordinate station I had in these years before the war done nothing wittingly or willingly to impair the chances of a peaceable solution, and had tried my best as opportunity offered to make good relations possible between England and Germany. I thank God I could feel also in that hour that our country was guiltless of all intended purpose of war. Even if we had made some mistakes in the handling of this awful crisis, though I do not know them, from the bottom of our hearts we could say that we had not willed it. Germany, it seemed, had rushed with head down and settled resolve to her own undoing. And if this were what she had meant all along, if this was the danger which had really menaced us hour by hour during the last 10 years, and would have hung over us hour by hour until the crash eventually came, was it not better that it should happen now that she had put herself so hopelessly in the wrong, now that we were ready beyond the reach of surprise, now that France and Russia and Great Britain were all in the line together? The First Sea Lord and the Chief of the Staff came in with French admirals, who had hurried over to concert in detail arrangements for the cooperation of the 2 fleets in the Channel and in the Mediterranean. They were fine figures in uniform, and very grave. One felt in actual contact with these French officers how truly the crisis was life or death for France. They spoke of basing the French fleet on Malta, that same Malta for which we had fought Napoleon for so many years, which was indeed the very pretext of the renewal of the war in 1803. Little did the Napoleon of St. Helena dream that in her most desperate need, France would have at her disposal the great Mediterranean base which his strategic instincts had deemed vital. I said to the admirals, "Use Malta as if it were Toulon." The minutes passed slowly. Once more, now in the march of centuries, Old England was to stand forth in battle against the mightiest thrones and dominations. Once more in defence of the liberties of Europe and the common right must she enter upon a voyage of great toil and hazard, across waters uncharted, towards coasts unknown, guided only by the stars. Once more the far-off line of storm-beaten ships was to stand between the continental tyrant and the dominion of the world. It was 11 o'clock at night, 12 by German time, when the ultimatum expired. The windows of the Admiralty were thrown wide open in the warm night air. Under the roof from which Nelson had received his orders were gathered a small group of admirals and captains and a cluster of clerks, pencil in hand, waiting. Along the mall, from the direction of the palace, the sound of an immense concourse singing "God Save the King" floated in. On this deep wave there broke the chimes of Big Ben, and as the first stroke of the hour boomed out, a rustle of movement swept across the room. The war telegram, which meant "Commence hostilities against Germany," was flashed to the ships and establishments under the white ensign all over the world. I walked across the Horse Guards parade to the Cabinet Room and reported to the Prime Minister and the ministers who were assembled there, that the deed was done.